John with me, Michael and Robert. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me. Um, Today we're talking about something which I think is really important to talk about. We're going to be talking essentially about an idea which comes up all the time in conversations around Israel and Palestine or Israel and Gaza, whatever you want to call it. Particularly since the 90s, it's been a very common idea that's discussed in the context of the conflict. And that's the idea of colonialism. And we're going to say what we think about that, talk about how it's used, whether we think it's right to talk about it like that, whether it has any merits or demerits. So, Michael, I'll start with you, as per usual. Um, so what do you think about it when people say Israel? It brings up the idea of colonialization in relation to Israel. Do you think there's anything appropriate about that? And why did they do it?
Uh, I don't think there's anything appropriate about it. I think the reason they do it is to associate it with colonialism in the minds of people. The colonialism that, for European colonialism and colonizing Africa and the Americas, because I think that they understand that people have a negative association with that. So first of all, it's inappropriate. Now, I looked up a few definitions of colonialism in preparation for the show, and there's a few different ones. And ultimately, it says that there's no clear definition, there's no accepted definition, but it's normally when a nation takes over the territory of a foreign land. So there was no nation of Israel that was able to take over a foreign land. There were just Jews. So right there, it doesn't really fit. It also normally has to do with the subjugation of a people, which that didn't happen. And it's often or usually for the exploitation of resources in order to benefit the mother country, which of course there was no mother country. So they were not able or not and wouldn't be able to do that even if they wanted to.
Mhm. Okay. Well, I want to just ask you all first that initial question, then we'll dissect it a little bit. John, do you come across people you talking about colonialism in relation to Israel? I think you must do. What do you think about it?
Yeah, it's it's either colonialism or apartheid or genocide. One of those three they like to throw out, which, like Michael said, just give a bad connotation, and they're hoping people then look at the whole situation from a biased lens to their view. But yeah, it's not colonialism for many reasons, but um, even if it were, it is the most justified uh, example of colonialism probably in the history of the human race. So, and then as far as a justification for the Palestinian cause, uh, it is not that, even if it was truly colonialism. So the whole argument is just bogus.
Mhm. And Robert, so do you think, well, same question, what do you think? But then also, um, do you think do you think there are anti-concepts being used here? I think that's almost something that we can kind of uniquely contribute to the discussion as objectivists. Is the way people are using colonialism, is it an anti-concept, do you think, or is it something else?
It's a good question, and it's it's become perverted and distorted so much that it seems like an anti-concept. The idea that we did colonize, for example, the West colonized the United States. Colonialism takes that idea and then imports in a modern context. If nowadays a country were to go to an established, already rights respecting civilization and then establish colonies, well, we would call that colonialization. I suppose that makes it an anti-concept. The idea that colonialism would apply, it's that perversion of language that Harry Binswanger talked about at the beginning of November. The idea that Gaza or West Bank are being treated as colonies of Israel is bizarre on its face. Israel is not trying to take over these lands. They're not trying to make them like the rest of Israel. Would that they would. The people there then would be part of a rights respecting nation. The reason why you have settlements, for example, in these nations, when it is legitimate, and there are questionable instances, is precisely for the security of Israel, to stop the bastards from shooting rockets daily at Israel. So no, you mentioned words that we hear a lot. Colonialism's one of them. More often I hear imperialism, which in this context amounts to the same perversion of language. Again, Israel does not, the worst parts of the relationship, the supposed colonies, the worst parts of it in the eyes of those who are anti-Israel, Israel does not want any of that. And Israel and the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the government of Israel would be more than happy to end the need for Gaza, for the West Bank to be blockaded, to be under the security eye of Israel. So no, colonialism does not apply in any once legitimate sense of the word. It's not used in an honest way, just like imperialism is not used in an honest way. It's a complicated enough situation that every time I hear the word come up, I have to ask myself, does this person really get what they're saying? Because not everybody is as bad in that regard, but it's not legitimate. Ultimately, once you understand the situation, this ain't colonialism, this ain't imperialism. It's not anything like either of those.
Mm. It's something that comes up, I guess, when we get into discussions of the history. Now, I guess people bring it up in other contexts as well, but Israel, so to the extent that there's something kind of legitimate or maybe plausible sounding about it, I guess, because Israel comes out of the British Mandate of Palestine and Britain, the British Empire was still very much dominant in the world at the time. I can understand why people kind of would hear that kind of allegation and think, yeah, this is colonial because the British Empire is huge. The British controlled the mandate of Palestine that they received from I suppose it would have been the League of Nations, not the United Nations at the time. And it comes out of that. But so James just gave a super chat, by the way, which I'll just read out because it's relevant. It was $2. Thank you, James. It said, the migration of civilized people is good, which is true. I don't know whether he had the history in mind when he was talking about that, but basically in the early 20th century, there is Jewish migration into the area completely legally. I was looking up some statistics, and by the early 30s, apparently it's 30% of the British Mandate was Jewish. And then once the Nazis get elected, that doubles to something like 30-something%. And then this basically leads to kind of rising ethnic tensions throughout the 30s. It leads to the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 39, which stated intention is to stop Jewish immigration to the area. And basically the British officials give in and stop Jewish immigration to the mandate at the same time as the Nazis are launching World War II. Perhaps, the worst time they could have done that. So there's all this immigration. And then after World War II, a few years later, the British Mandate ends in 1948, and David Ben Gurion, if I'm getting his name right, announces after a UN resolution, announces the creation of the Israeli state. And now I don't think you can consider that colonialism. I think the reason why Israel has to be created as a separate country is because then of the war that's declared on it, and basically because of the anti-Semitic violence that is waged on the Jews. So I don't think it's right to say that Israel was the product of kind of people who invaded and settled and stole land and so on. I don't think that really matches up to how the history went. Michael, you're pretty knowledgeable on the history as well. Does that match up to your knowledge of it or not?
You sound right to me. There's an irony here in that, in essence, the imperialism ended with the creation of the Jewish state because that's when the British were done, right? The British ceded their mandate. They turned the area over to the UN. And before that, of course, it was run by the Ottomans, and there was a whole bunch of empires, some of which I don't even remember the names of, that ran the area before then. I think there's a deeper problem here, to be perfectly honest, in that colonialism is thought of as just like a one-way evil, where there was just these evil Westerners who went and conquered these poor, prosperous people, which is, of course, a myth, right? When the British colonized India, it wasn't as if India was a beacon of liberty and prosperity. Now, I'm not saying that justifies taking a country over. I'm just saying it's not as if you have just this one set of bad guys and everybody else on the planet was good. And that's kind of or the view that is imposed on us about colonialism, right? And it's just not the case. And it's also not just the West that did it. And the ancient Egyptians, of course, were, colonizing and controlling the areas around them as well. That's the human condition. So I think perhaps in order to get a better a clearer view is, first of all, identify that Israel is not a colony, but also to say that colonization, although it was, I don't believe was a moral practice, wasn't the epitome of evil either that it's made out to be.
Mm. Well, then coming back to you, John. I mean, so what are your thoughts about empire as well? Because I guess even going further afield than Israel, imperialism is something that's hot, or colonialism is something that's kind of hot on people's minds, even though kind of the world empires have kind of seceded. It's something that's spoken about in academia constantly. Um, what's your impression of it?
Yeah, it's as if they don't see any difference between monarchies and democratic republics and constitutional uh, governments. All this colonization and imperialism, that was primarily a consequence of tyrannies. There were no governments protecting individual rights back then. It was a free-for-all. It was a mess. You had two cultures that couldn't speak the same language coming together. I know that the academia likes to try and analogize the situation in Israel with the Native Americans here in the US, but it's just such a different uh, situation. You had individuals coming over for a long time before America was even formed and getting into spats with Native Americans, which weren't completely unjustified. They couldn't speak the same language. Both sides are kind of afraid of each other. You know, one side accidentally shoots first. You know, it creates this mess that could last for years or decades. And then to put all that onto the US, you know, now is such a package deal or unjust. Was half of it was started with the British monarchy, you know, because they didn't know how to handle them either. So, and then you look at the Israeli situation, and it's even more complicated because you have all these governments involved, all these governments from the UN coming together trying to figure out what to do with all the Nazi refugees, or I'm sorry, with all the Jewish refugees. And no country wanted them. Even before World War II, you had the Russians pushing them out, and then they had their revolution. And so all these 100,000 Jewish people were moving out of Eastern Europe, and they wanted to come to the US, and the US started a quota on them because too many were coming. And then you had uh, the Arab War, the late 20s or whatever, 30s, I mean, and then World War II. It was just a mess. What were they supposed to do with all the refugees when no country, not South America, not Europe, not US, not Russia wanted them? And so they came together as the world and voted. That's democracy. I thought that's what you guys all liked. And now apparently that's, you know, looking back in hindsight, they don't think it was the right move. Well, that doesn't give you justification to go rape and murder the people that you disagreed with. Like, it's just, it boggles my mind. Even if it is colonialism, this is my main point. It doesn't matter. It doesn't justify anything that the Palestinians or Hamas has done. If someone stole your land, it does not give you justification to go back to your land, kill everyone, rape them, slaughter them, mutilate them. None of that makes sense. So, it's like they want to treat this whole thing as an emergency situation, as if you know, they're being killed the way that they're killing. It is. It's just a complete reverse. Everything that the Palestinians do gets blamed on Israel.
Mm. And Robert, I don't know if this is contentious to say, but you probably have the best knowledge of, I think, probably of Ayn Rand's thought of everyone here. So Ayn Rand was, I think, probably quite controversial in her views on colonialism. That I think, if I'm getting this right, I think there's somewhere where she said she thinks colonialism was a good thing. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, actually, I think James will be our subject matter expert on that. But she made the point several times that in a clash of this kind, the nation that is bringing civilization to the area is the side that is in the right and that we must support. She said that about American history with regard to the American Indians, very, very controversial when she said that in the 1970s. And she said exactly that about the situation in the Middle East. That is, and she could not have been more right. That Israel represents the forces of civilization. Well, that sounds a little disconnected. And I can imagine our academics saying, how dare you impose your idea of civilization? But she was absolutely right. What that means is that Israel is the nation, the one nation in the Middle East that respects individual rights. Our academics can't understand it because their standard of value is egalitarianism and utilitarianism. So they believe the ideals are socialism, some kind of social democracy. And so they look at free markets, they look at individual rights as oppressive. They look at Israel, a country that more than anywhere else in that part of the world respects individual rights. They have Arabic people on the Knesset, in the government. You go to Gaza and look for the Israelis that are in the government. The amazing thing about our academics is because their ideals are socialism, social democracy, they can't see capitalism and constitutionalism, individual rights, as anything but bad. And that means they side with a theocracy. It's jaw-dropping that they will criticize, for example, religious Americans, and Lord knows I criticize religious Americans, and can't look at a country, it's not even a country, a territory like Gaza, which is 99% Sunni Islam. And what's the 1% are Christian Arabs. I doubt you'll find any Jews in Gaza. And think, well, that's okay. But these imperialist capitalists in Israel, well, that's unacceptable. It boggles the mind. And the idea that this is, again, colonialism, when the vast majority of the cases in which there have been any kind of settlements have been for the security of Israel and required for the security of Israel. This is not arbitrary. It's not like there are people in Israel saying, wow, the West Bank, what great deserts. We want to live there. Gaza, oh, what a charming place. We want to live there. No, this is, when it is done rationally, when it is done validly, and that is the vast majority of the time, this is necessary for the security of Israel. Why is it necessary for the security of Israel? Because they're at war. Since October 7th? No, they've been at war since the 1940s on a regular basis. Call them Palestinians if you like, the people in the West Bank, the people in Gaza, and even people in Lebanon, they're firing missiles at them. The last time we talked, I made the point. Imagine for a second, just imagine that somebody, much less the government, in Canada started firing rockets on a daily basis at the United States. You can't even imagine it. Imagine if they sent troops to the United States, to murder 1,200 people and to take 240 of them hostage, and add to that the way in which people were murdered, brutalized, raped, slaughtered, hacked to bits, like something out of the worse than the worst horror movie you can imagine. What would the United States do? What would any civilized country do if their neighbors did that? No matter what the accusations of colonialism or imperialism or oppression. And people said, well, just lift the barricades, lift the boycotts, stop oppressing Gaza. To the extent there are those restrictions, and there are, this is what is necessary, for better or for worse, to stop the rockets as best you can, to stop the aggression as best you can. And what was their reward for that? The reward for that was October 7th. 5,000 rockets fired into the country. And then the slaughter of 1,200 individuals, not military. This was not a military action. We're talking as much civilians as we are about people in the military. And there are still, I cannot overemphasize this, because it's not possible to overemphasize the fact that there are still hostages in Gaza. What do you do when innocent men, women, and children are taken hostage? Well, obviously, what you do is you say, Gaza has started a war. and we need to fight them, and we need to win that war. And that's what needs to happen as soon as possible. And I'll make one more point real quick, because I know I'm going on, but Gaza, Hamas, the people of Gaza, to the extent that any of them still function as human beings, but the people of Hamas, if they had a shred of I was going to say humanity, of even being human in them, could stop the war today. Hamas needs to surrender because they're going to lose anyway, and let this war end. Israel can't end the war. Are they going to surrender? That would be slaughter. It would be suicide. It would be asking for the second Holocaust. No. The end of this war is going to be when Hamas is defeated, or when they all put their hands up and say, here we are, lock us up for our lives or shoot us. I don't see that happening. Israel's got to win this war. Cries of colonialism or imperialism are an outrage in the context of what has happened over the last 104 days.
So you mentioned before Ayn Rand's view of colonialism, or I asked you about it, so you were speaking about it. I guess there's part of me that when she says, I'm pretty sure, can't remember, is when maybe on her appearance at Donahue, where she's speaking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think she might say something like colonialism is good or something like that. And there's part of me that sort of balks when she says that. But I think there's some feeling. Yeah, but I think there's something that she's getting at, which is what you were talking about, which is right, which is that her view of what justifies a state, which is if it protects individual rights, if it's a kind of rights respecting free country.
You can't say we should respect the rights of the American Indians if they don't respect rights within their own nation. And you can't say that we should respect the rights of the people in Gaza when they are living under the thumb of, no, not Israel, but Hamas, their own damn government. They have no individual rights. So yes, colonialism is good if it means you go in and you establish a system of individual rights. And there may be people there who don't even want it, but those people are ballast. That's irrelevant. I go back to James's original comment, the migration of civilized people is good. He's right. And that is the understatement of the day.
Yeah. And I guess in a sense, her view of what justifies a state goes against, I think, probably what are quite commonly accepted ideas of national self-determination, national sovereignty, and things like that. Because I think basically she doesn't think that you can vote anything through so long as it's democratic.
You cannot vote away the rights of your own people, and you cannot have your rights respected if you do that to your own people.
Yeah. So even if the majority of people in Gaza want to live in a kind of a theocratic dictatorship or anything like that, she would basically view that as not a legitimate political project, and that if someone wants to come in and establish a free country or a free government, a free system of government, they can do that, because what the government should be looking to do is to benefit the good people in a society, not the people who want to kind of tear it down and take it back. So I think that's part of what informs her view, and I think that's a bit foreign to people's understanding. I think that's why it's she can say these things which sound very controversial to contemporary ears, but I think that's where she's coming from. So let's go the way people, we were talking a lot about the history, I guess. So Michael, the way people might hear what we've just said and say, okay, maybe Israel isn't an imperial power for how it was founded, but they'll say something like the way they've exercised control over the Gaza Strip, control of water, electricity, things like that, basically means they have de facto control. Or they'll use this other concept, which I think is very important. They'll use the idea that they're exercising domination onto Gaza, and therefore it's a kind of de facto colonialism. Even if Israel's a legitimate state today, they're exercising colonial influence over Gaza now. What do you think about that kind of idea?
There's a couple things. One is the people who make those kind of judgments, they inevitably couch them in moral terms. But if you ask them, by what standard are you making that type of judgment to say that Israel is wrong, they have no reply to that. The other thing is that I've been finding absolutely astounding is the degree to which people involved in the debate on Israel don't even agree on basic facts. Like, if we were debating American history, for instance, everybody here would admit okay, there was slavery in America. The Civil War happened. After the Civil War, there was, there was an end to slavery. And we might debate whether it could have ended sooner, whether it could have ended without a war, whether it was appropriate for the time. There's all types of things, but everybody would agree on that. But people don't even agree on what's happening in Israel and what's happened in the past. I mean, it ranges from the Arab countries in going back to 48, told the Palestinians to leave their houses and that they would allow them back once they drove the Jews into the sea, to the other, the other point of view is the Jews basically came there, bulldozed their houses, threw them out, and, forced them to become refugees. And that makes discussion extremely difficult when one, you don't have a common moral base from which to discuss the issue, and two, when you can't even agree on basic facts. I don't really know how you resolve this.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, or it's a good point. There's a lot of the discussions, like if you watch really long form debates about this issue, among whether it's amongst academics or whether it's kind of commentators, they all end up coming back to disagreeing about the points of the history, or having it, or even if they'll agree X thing happened on X date at X time in X manner, they'll disagree on their interpretation of that thing. So that's one of the reasons why history is very important, but it's one of the things that makes it very difficult. But what do you think about the point about Israel is a colonial power because they're exercising domination over Gaza?
Well, I think it's nonsense. They don't want to exercise domination over Gaza. They don't want to be in Gaza. They would much rather have peaceful neighbors that were controlling their own territory and not lobbing rockets at them or committing suicide attacks against them. This idea that this problem is a result of Israel is so nonsensical. Just maybe yesterday it was, Iran launched an attack on Pakistan and in Iraq because somebody a few weeks back or a week back launched an attack inside of Iran. The Shiites and the Sunnis have been fighting each other for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was no peaceful utopia of Arab Muslims prior to the Jews arriving in Israel. The Jews are just one more enemy that the rest of the people tend to consolidate around, but it's not as if you're dealing with an abundance of peace-loving people over there anyways. If there was never an Israeli state, the area would still be marked by war, death, and destruction because you're dealing with religious fanatics. And when you're dealing with religious fanatics who think that they have the right to kill you for what you believe, you're going to have problems, whether you're Jew, Christian, atheist, or another Muslim who just happens to believe differently.
Mm. And so another way that colonialism comes up, I guess, is from, well, we mentioned academia, it's from the academy, and there's this whole field of study of post-colonial theory. And it's something which I unfortunately know a fair bit about from my time at uni, and then also from studying with Nikos at ARU. And he's very good on all of this stuff. And so one of the things that they'll point to is that more than just kind of literal violence of the Israeli military doing something, they'll say that Israel is a colonial power because they wield epistemic violence, which is a really weird idea, isn't it? What is epistemic violence? Is that even a thing? And so they'll say something like, the way we use language is inherently baked into power dynamics. And so the way you use language is exercising domination over someone. And so they'll point to like a word like savages. And we on the channel very often refer to, or at least certainly Razzie does, and I think some other people do too, the people in Gaza as being savages or as being uncivilized. James earlier said the migration of civilized people is a good thing. And so they would say something like, since you're classifying these people as civilized, you're inherently kind of deprivileging the people on the other end. So what do you guys think about it? So John, I'll come to you first. Like, what do you think it's about? Can we call people savages, or are we sort of oppressing them with our language? Or like, is there any validity in that, or is that just an anti-concept as well?
Yeah, I think it's mostly an anti-concept or possibly a package deal. It just how I just can't see a way around the idea that if you don't recognize individual rights and the freedom of people around you, then you are a savage. Like, what civilization is not possible without that idea. So I'm not going to call you civilized, that's for sure. And their tactics, their ideology, it's barbaric. I'm not going to couch that just to make them feel better when they're in the wrong. It reminds me of the leftist idea of, words can be aggression or whatever type of thing. I think it's along all those lines. The things they do to their women and the things they teach their kids, the things that they do to gay people, it's just, they are not civilized, and they're not trying to be either. If they were trying to be more civilized, perhaps, I wouldn't call them that so directly, but yeah.
Well, you are wielding oppression upon them, John. But so, Robert, I'll come to you as well. So, what do you think about that kind of idea that the way we use language is a tool of colonialism as well? Because I think that's what's lurking in the background of a lot of this is also.
Yeah, I think the people who make that claim need to be addressed on their level. Because there's the kernel of truth there is that language is everything. As the conceptual animal try to function without words. Words are everything, and what we mean by words is everything. So the question isn't, do our words have the kind of power they suggest it does? The question is, are they connected to reality? Are the words that we use having that power because some powerful truth is being stated? Ultimately, it'll have to be argued on those truths, but I am perfectly willing to let the so-called epistemologists, those who would say that we are using epistemic violence, I am willing to grant them their premise. Ayn Rand said the truth or falsity of all of man's conclusions, inferences, thought, knowledge rests on the truth or falsity of his definitions, of words, of concepts. So they're right. Now, why are the words that, let's say we, those of us who are on this side of the conflict, those of us who are fighting for individual rights, for the individuals, for human life, for Western civilization, why are our words so powerful that these professors can see them as an instance of epistemic violence? Because we're right. And because these words are tied to our highest values. It's precisely what they do, using words which poison the debate, words like colonialism in this context, that makes their point that, yes, the words are powerful. And when you see a word that is doing more work, that is carrying more weight, that is having a bigger impact than the facts of reality which it defines deserve, then yes, challenge that. So I don't think there's any problem with the declaration other than the claim that, well, we don't do that. We academics, we professors, we intellectuals. No, it's you people who are poisoning the language. Well, I'm sorry. Language does matter. Language can poison a debate. But if anybody is doing that, it is the people throwing around accusations in the context of a war like this, a war of self-defense, of colonialism and imperialism and genocide, et cetera, et cetera.
And I suppose what they would say is that if you really press them on it, I suppose they would say that we are engaged in, a power discourse or whatever. We're just playing for keeps, in a sense. It's a zero-sum game, and you have to sort of manipulate the language to be in your favor. And I guess that's basically they think that's what there is.
We need to question that premise, because they're making it sound like it's all power, it's all language, it's all manipulation. And the answer is no. Words are powerful, but only because, and Lord knows we can't just teach them Ayn Rand's theory of concepts, but it should be clear enough to anybody who has studied language. Words are powerful because we're talking about the facts that those words describe. So yes, words are powerful and can be misused in a way that plays power games. Doesn't mean that it's all rhetoric, it's all logic. It's all words disconnected from reality. Again, in some ways, I admire the premise because it suggests that words are as powerful as they are. The idea that therefore means that we are just ruining the conversation, poisoning the conversation by using certain words. No, there's some of that out there on both sides, but when it happens, it's just rhetoric, and it's not, I'm sure they would say, systemic on either side, but especially on the side of those who are for individual rights, those of us who are willing to ground our concepts in the facts on the ground.
And I suppose really the critique of the idea of epistemic violence, they are giving ideas like the respect that they deserve in the sense that it's important to think about the language we use and the concepts we use. But I suppose epistemic violence is really a package deal because violence is a really kind of fundamental concept, and it's something that isn't able to, violence doesn't even arise when what you're using are words and ideas.
Yeah. Ironically, these are the same people who make the claim that silence is violence. So that tells you how far they're willing to go with that.
And Michael, you must have encountered this as well, because I think this kind of thinking underpins a lot of the kind of culture wars of today. Kind of the whole sort of controversy around free speech is really underpinned by these ideas that words and ideas can be a kind of violence. So what do you think about that?
I'm sorry, I'm dealing with a problem 5-year-old, so I didn't hear the question. Can you ask me again, please?
So we were talking about the idea of epistemic violence, and that's something that comes up in post-colonial theory and critiques of colonialism, and it's something that since especially the 90s has kind of been applied to Israel. So kind of so a key example that I kind of was thinking of was that they'll say that by the way we use language sort of engages in a discourse of power where we privilege one group and we disadvantage or oppress another. And an example which they might pick is like the word savages, which we use on the channel fairly frequently. Like these people are savage, they're uncivilized, and so on. And that kind of thinking, I think, underpins a lot of the culture wars today. So I was just, what do you think about it? Can we use the word savages, or is it something we should maybe forego?
I really struggle with that because the word savage means a specific thing. And I one time had a debate with somebody who had read Ayn Rand's essay on racism, where she said that you can't hate people or judge people negatively because their ancestors were savages. And the guy said, that's a racist remark. And I pointed out to him, well, you realize that my ancestors were savages as well, as were all of our ancestors were savages. But the word gained a certain connotation for him that he couldn't see past it. So on one hand, I'm reluctant to turn over the tool of language to nefarious actors, to people who are dishonest. But on the other hand, language is supposed to clarify, it's not supposed to obfuscate. And sometimes using a term like savage can do that. And I really don't know what the solution there is, because if you're trying to get a point across to somebody, but a word like savage is going to prevent the point from getting there, or maybe it's better not to use it. But then I kind of feel like the enemies of reality are winning.
Yeah, I get that point. It's one of these things that when I'm talking with someone who's maybe coming from a kind of lefty perspective, you kind of have to negotiate kind of like what you're going to say, because if you use the word savage, they will basically, it'll throw up so many kind of red flags for them that I think in their mind you'll basically be labeled as like someone who's a racist. And therefore it's going to be so much harder just to have a basic conversation with them, because the words will go into their ears, but then they're not going to be processed because they're in almost like in a state of panic. So I think that's a fair point. But so colonialism as well. So how do we convince people that this isn't the right way to think about it? Because I guess one of the things that once you've read Ayn Rand is you notice bad concepts popping up everywhere, right? And it kind of like, it's like whack-a-mole. You can't whack them down fast enough. So if someone was if you heard someone talking about colonialism in the context of Israel, what would you say to convince them out of it? I'll start with you, Michael, and then we'll work our way back around. So what would you say, Michael?
It ultimately would depend on who I was speaking to. If you're speaking to diehard leftist academics like a normal Norman Finkelstein, for instance, I'm not going to convince him. I'm not going to convince a Scott Horton. But if I were talking to somebody that was trying to learn about the topic, that was open-minded, I would begin by saying, well, we need to get a clear definition. Like Robert said, definitions are vital. So how are we defining colonialism? What does it mean? And why is it bad? Is it necessarily bad? And then we could talk about the history of Israel and say, does this fit with that definition? Is the behavior of Israel immoral? Is it, and by what standard is it immoral? I mean, there's a vast array of concepts, like you just said, and it's hard because people that don't have precision in their use of concepts, it makes it very difficult. But I think that's what you have to do, is just define your terms properly and then have an honest discussion about the history. And I mean, how many colonial powers go out of their way in the way that Israel does to minimize casualties of people that are attacking them? How many countries allow the people that they're allegedly oppressing to serve in their parliaments? How many of them give the citizens of the countries they've conquered full citizenship of their own country? It just doesn't make sense to refer to Israel in that way. Now, whether that would be effective or not, again, I think it depends on to whom you're communicating.
For sure. John, same question.
Yeah, there's some great points Michael made there about going back and just definitely getting to the definition right away of what they define as colonialism, because like you said, it was there's no one settled definition. But I actually, because I'm not a historian and I'm not an expert on the history of that region or Israel even, I tend to center my argument on the fact that it doesn't matter what happened 100 years ago or 80 years ago. Your ancestors stealing another set of ancestors' land doesn't justify you going in and just blanket terrorizing and slaughtering people. The Indians, the Native Americans, I mean, were not treated fairly in many cases by our government, and I know this. But that in no way would give them justification to come off their reservations into cities and kill and maim and rape. There's other ways to achieve those ends. And yeah, I tend to come at it from that way, that in a civilized people don't do certain things, even if they are wrong. There'd be no Jew alive or American, at least that's rational, that would claim that now we're justified to go back into Gaza and rape and mutilate their corpses and cut off their heads and all that stuff. No, that is not justified. It wouldn't matter. It didn't matter that they did the same thing. So it's just a double standard that is being applied that I try to show these people.
But yeah, it's the people who end up using these ideas can end up saying some astoundingly racist things, and that came up for me once around Native Americans, where I was shown this picture of this young girl at some protest somewhere who seemed to be of Native American heritage, and she was holding up this sign that said, like, "Get off my land," or something like, "This is the land, this is our land," and they kind of get into this kind of idea that they own property in effect because of blood, heritage, all this kind of stuff. And it's when you think about it, it's an appallingly awful idea, and it's something that comes up in the context of Israel as well. And Robert, same question. So, how do we go about convincing people away from some of these bad ideas like colonialism?
Yeah, well, as we say, the history is a part of it. Bonnie, who incidentally has a very kind super chat, thank you for that. But she said in the regular chat, the British won the war, and they were tasked with maintaining order in what was previously the Ottoman Empire. This was not a place in which the Arabic population was running several countries just fine, no problems. No, the history. So you would talk to them about the history, but even before I get into that, I would ask them when they say, oh, they're colonialists, I would ask, why do you think that? What would colonialism look like? And this gets back to a point I've made previously. And this only works if you're talking to people one-on-one. I think the rhetoric, the discussion, the kind of talk that we have right now is good for reaching large numbers of people. But if I can talk to somebody one-on-one, if I can actually reach a mind, and I hope those of you watching and listening to this are functioning as independent minds and thinking for yourself, what would colonialism look like? If this really was colonialist, what would a colonizing country do? What would an imperialist nation do? If Israel really did want to colonize in the Middle East, whatever places they could, what would that? It wouldn't look like this. Israel is much more competent if they really were trying to take over the world, or at least that part of the Levant, than to make it look like this. What would colonialism look like? I always say, what would the United States look like if we really were imperialists? If we really were trying to take over the world, would we fight wars and even win in countries like Iraq and then walk away and then walk out? No, this is not colonialism. This is not what colonialism would look like in any instance, whether by Israel or anyone else. And, we talked about the word savage. Ayn Rand used the word savage. What would savagery look like if anybody really was savage? On the morning of October 7th, Hamas led a wave of assaults with 5,000 rockets fired. They then used the barrage, the breaches in the border to kill 1,200 people. And not counting the 5,000 wounded people, 243 people taken hostage. Now, there are people who are making claims that people weren't raped, or at least it was exaggerated. People weren't brutalized. They weren't really cutting hands and arms and legs off of people. Fortunately, people have taken on the project. The websites are out there if you can stomach them. And I will tell you, I am one of the people that cannot. But if you can stomach it, and I've seen enough of these videos already, you can watch. And they are sourced, and they will tell you, this video was taken by one of the victims. This video was taken by one of the Palestinians who was bragging about the number of people he killed and the horrific ways in which he did it. That information is out there for anybody with eyes to see it. Again, who can stomach it. If that is not savagery, again, we're not talking about freedom fighters and a military action. If those aren't savages, the word has no meaning whatsoever. So if somebody wants to ask me, well, Robert, these people are colonialists. What do you think of that? So what do you think colonialism is, and what would that look like if that was actually what's going on here?
Very good. So I'm just going to read out the final super chats before we start to wrap up. So we have $3.99 from Marilyn. Thank you so much. And $3.99 from Jonathan as well. Thank you, Jonathan. And then $2 from Bonnie, which Robert mentioned. Then $2 from Frank Grail, who said, watch Dr. Bruce Gillies' The Case for Colonialism. I haven't heard of that before, but that sounds interesting. A provocatively put title. And then $2 Canadian from Jeff Bannister. Okay. Well, let's start to wrap up then, guys. So for everyone who's watching, we do have memberships for the YouTube channel. You guys can always become YouTube members. That entitles you to a number of benefits. You can also become a member of Ayn Rand Centre UK and support our work if you think it's worthwhile. And then, so guys, John, where can people find you? Where can they buy your paintings? All that stuff.
My website is wosart.com, WOSART.com. And then you can also get my stuff at Quint Cordair Fine Art. I have a lot of stained glass and painting there.
That's pretty cool that you make stained glass. It doesn't seem like something that people do very much anymore. But there you go. I'll go have a look at that.
Pretty rare.
And then, Robert, where can people find you as well?
Links to everything I do are at robertnacer.com. And thanks especially, we've had new patrons this month, people who support the podcasts and the work that I do. I do appreciate that, but it's all at robertnacer.com.
Fantastic. And then, Michael, where can people find you?
My podcast is called The Rational Egoist. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get podcasts. And it's pretty good if I don't say so myself.
Yeah, I'm a regular listener, so there you go. I enjoy it too. And so links to all that will be in the description, guys. And thank you very much for joining, everyone. The reality show will be back tomorrow. and we'll see you then. Thank you.